Hi Music Theory 1. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the guidelines that you need to know as you're creating your first species counterpoint melodies. The first guideline I'm going to be talking to you guys about is the rhythm of the first species counterpoint melodies. When you're creating your counterpoint melodies, you're going to be using whole notes only. Since the cantus firmus is also using whole notes, writing a melody using whole notes creates a note-to-note relationship between the cantus firmus and the counterpoint. And this allows you to focus on creating two separate melodies that sound good together, essentially. I'm sure Bo has mentioned this before, but this is the first step in a pedagogical method that has the goal of creating what is going to eventually be polyphonic music. The second guideline that I'm going to be talking to you guys about is how to begin and how to end your first species counterpoint melodies. When you begin your first species counterpoint melodies, you want to start on the most stable interval possible. With this in mind, your counterpoint will start either on a fifth above or an octave above the cantus firmus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the reason why I sung along with my major scale will become a bit more clear when I talk to you about how to end your counterpoint piece. So in first species, and really in all counterpoint, it's best practice to end your counterpoint an octave above your cantus firmus. However, the way that it gets to this octave is pretty specific in the counterpoint species. Typically, the cantus firmus will resolve down from the second note of the scale to the first note. 1, 2, 1. As a consequence, the counterpoint needs to resolve up by going from the seventh note of the scale, 7, 8. What this does is it creates intervals between the counterpoint and the cantus firmus, going from a major sixth to the octave. In a minor key, there's one additional thing that you need to do to create a counterpoint ending that abides by the first species counterpoint guidelines. So let me play and sing the minor scale for you guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So if we create an ending using the notes that I played and sang in the scale, the ending is going to sound like this. The second and the seventh note resolving to an octave. The additional change that you need to make in the counterpoint melody is raising the note that will resolve to the tonic, or the seventh note, up a semitone or a half step before it resolves to the tonic note. So instead of sounding like this, it'll sound like this. There are a couple of reasons behind this change. One is that it outlines an authentic cadence, which you guys are going to be talking about a little bit later on in the class. But I just wanted to give you that preview before I moved on to the other guidelines. The third guideline I'm going to be talking to you about are the harmonic intervals that you can between the cantus firmus and the counterpoint melodies that are allowed to be used in first species counterpoint. So the only intervals that you can use in this species are consonant intervals. So just to review, the consonant intervals that are allowed are the third, the fifth, the sixth, and the eighth. With that being said, dissonant intervals such as seconds, or notes that are right next to each other, sevenths, and any augmented and diminished intervals are also forbidden in first species counterpoint composition. Now you may be wondering why perfect fourths and unisons are forbidden from first species counterpoint, and there are a couple of reasons why you can't include them in this method of writing counterpoint. So for unisons, there are a couple of reasons why they're forbidden, but the most important reason is that by having a unison in the counterpoint melodies, you're kind of defeating the purpose of writing first species counterpoint in the first place, because you are focused on eventually creating melodies that are independent from one another. So if you're playing the same note, you are kind of veering away from that independence between the two melodies that you're supposed to be creating. Now the reason why perfect fourths aren't included in first species counterpoint is a little bit more complicated, but the most important reason is because the fourth is one semitone away from a major third, which is one of the consonant intervals that are allowed in first species counterpoint. So if we would have used, if a perfect fourth was allowed in first species counterpoint, because it's so close to the third in the scale, it would tend to want to resolve directly to the third. And what this results in is a suspension, which isn't practiced in this species quite yet, but you'll get to it later on. For the fourth guideline, I'm going to be talking about how we approach perfect intervals. So remember, that is going to be the perfect fifth and an octave, because the perfect fourth is forbidden from first species counterpoint. When we approach the perfect fifth and octaves, we should be approaching these intervals in contrary or oblique motion. And we never approach these intervals in parallel or similar motion. The reason that we do this is because doing so would kind of defeat the purpose of creating two independent lines. If we approach both of these intervals in parallel motion, the lines sound way too similar. And that's something that we want to be avoiding when we're writing first species counterpoint melodies. These last couple of guidelines are going to be talking primarily about some things you need to consider when you compose your counterpoint melody. One thing that you need to consider is that the counterpoint needs to have a single high point. Since the cantus firmus is a melody of its own, with its own particular high point, you need to make sure that your counterpoint high point doesn't occur at the same time that your cantus firmus high point occurs. When you're composing your melody, it's suggested that it's primarily stepwise, but that doesn't mean that you can't include leaps. When you do include leaps, these need to be followed by the voices moving in stepwise motion in the contrary direction. So if you leap up to a note, the next note needs to be the note right below it. And if you move down, or if you leap down, the note following has to be the note directly above. A couple of other things that you need to think about are that voice crossing is not permitted. So your cantus firmus can't move into the range that your counterpoint is in, and your counterpoint can't move into the cantus firmus range at all. Like, that's not allowed. In addition, leaps by augmented seconds, diminished fifths, augmented fourths, and sevenths are not permitted at all. That's because these are dissonant intervals. And lastly, accidentals are permitted to raise the sixth and the seventh notes, and they're allowed to raise the seventh at the end of a minor key, as we mentioned earlier.
Here's a summary of all of the guidelines that we talked about in this slideshow. I hope that this was really helpful for all of you, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask Bo or myself during office hours. Thanks again for listening.